Hey there, thanks for clicking on this video. In this track, we discussed bioethics and delved into questions like, would you genetically engineer your kid, or are we scared of the tech or the policies that contextualize it? Throughout this episode, we realized that we had more questions than answers. So hop in, come along. I hope you have as much fun and ethical crises as we did. Hello and welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a Civics Unplugged series where community members come together to participate in a meaningful discussion on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. Hi, my name is Shehi, and I am a high school junior from Dayton, Ohio, joined today by our wonderful CU community members, some of which are calling in from the other side of the world to talk about bioethics. So, once you see your name on the screen, please give a brief introduction, 3 words of association, and why.
Hi, I'm Madison. I'm a high school senior from Burgess, Oklahoma, and my 3 words would be excited to learn because I just read the definition of bioethics that Gary sent in the chat, and I don't have a super good grasp on what it is, so I'm excited to learn more.
I don't think Rushank's here, so we can move on to me, I guess. Um, I'm cheating. Not talked about enough. That's 4 words. I also skimmed that thing I sent right before this, or just a few minutes ago, the article. There are so many topics that are hugely important to the future of humanity that are far from obvious how to legislate around, etc. So I'm glad we're talking about it. I'm excited to see how this goes.
I'm sorry to butt in, but I don't see my name on the screen. Yep, thank you. Oh, yes. Hello, my name is Namishka, and I'm calling from the other side of the world. Um, I'm calling from India, and the word I have in mind when I think of bioethics would be unevolved because it's a relatively new subject and a lot of research is not done in it. So, yeah, unevolved.
Hey, Nick Varney here, and I'm education policy and design junkie, and the 3 words that I guess come to mind for me are progress, curiosity, and caution. I too not an expert here at all, and so there's so much promise. Obviously, we've seen so much, like we've seen so much good come from it, and I'm curious to see what more good can come from it. And obviously, when you're dealing with biology, specifically human biology, you do want to be pretty cautious there. So
Hi, my name is Ashton Napier. I'm 16 years old. And the 3 words that I think of are probably genes, paternity, and abortion, because those are the most mainstream issues.
Hi, my name is Chavakumba. I am 19 and based out of Toronto. And when I think of bioethics, I'm gonna play with the rules a little bit here, but case by case policy. Bioethics is one of those things where a lot of times it's really specific to like individuals and the situations that are in. And there's something really unique about creating policy that's flexible enough but provides enough guidelines. So that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, and the word I'd associate is Barbie because I think of it being highly like design oriented, and I'm afraid that there's a possibility that we might end up with like a human monoculture if we're not careful. So that's what I. Yeah, so since we've had our word associations, if anyone has a question or provocation that they'd like to start off with, you are welcome to go. Okay, so I actually have something on my mind. That would be if you were a parent, Would you be open to genetically editing your child?
Okay, I can go ahead. If I was a parent, I would be okay with genetically modifying my child because um, a lot of diseases that are carried forward from generation to generation can be, stopped. The diseases like diabetes and nothing comes to my head right now, but diabetes, yes. These conditions are usually genetically passed on from one generation to the other generation, and it could be life threatening if the child's immune system, for example, is not pretty strong. And I think having a short position where the individual will not be affected with this particular condition, I would be open to that.
Yeah, I would it would depend on what it was. If it was something for like a hereditary disease, like I completely agree. That's something I'd be open to. Although I wouldn't be someone who would be jumping in on the front of the lines while it was still experimental. No, I'm definitely I would not be an early adopter for something like that. Also, just randomly, has anyone else here seen Gattaca? Because it's a good movie and it's on this exact same topic. So yeah, any other Gattaca fans out there?
I've actually had there was a lot of mention of that movie in bioengineering, bioethics, CRISPR conversations, but I've never seen it before. But they've also talked about Brave New World as a reference.
Yeah, it's a fantastic film. Highly recommend it.
I feel like it's a safe assumption to make that like if there was a way to prevent or completely avoid like something that's like life threatening, everyone would be down for that. I think that where it gets into like really interesting territory or like ethically complicated territory is like recreational modification and like where the line draws in that. And even past that, like I'm thinking about the fact that like there are also certain like aesthetic preferences in the world that have implications on how like people treat you in life. So whether that's like skin color or even things like fat phobia, I feel like there's this opens a completely different pathway and that would like further enforce um that like distinction in society. Like that's my concern. It's like the things that are completely recreational, and how that can like it doesn't seem like it would really cause any issues, but like that has like a lot of widespread challenges for a lot of different communities, individuals. So I think that's where like as much as I'd be down for it in terms of like medical necessities, I like would have no argument against that. I wonder what like opening the pathway to all those other alternatives is the concern, I think.
Yeah, I just want to say something. I mean, having recreational uh, genetic changes, recreational genetic changes, is a rather difficult thing because a lot of things, for example, fat phobia that you said, um, your weight is actually not genetically passed on. Your mom and dad, for example, would be overweight, but but it is not certain that you would. It's more of a lifestyle change and lifestyle how you take care of your life that influences your weight. But some recreational or some aesthetic uh, things that are affected by your genes are your eye color, your um, hair color, your skin color also to a degree, but um, yeah, those things. And like you said, I think it should be open. I mean, recreational changes and aesthetic changes, along with clinical changes, should be open in bioethics. However, um, the consumers would be given a choice. I mean, as to do they want to go for these aesthetic changes? If they don't, they should be fine. I mean, everyone should be fine with it. If you just want to stick with, heredit diseases passed through heredity, that should, I think on priority, we should be keeping the clinical research going on, because I think, like I said, bio research, bioethics are relatively a very less research topic, and I feel like we should be focusing more on CRISPR technology and more on how we can prevent clinically, how we can prevent diseases that are passed on via generation to generation, rather than focusing on something, some aesthetic changes.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting ethical question to me, and it makes me want to pose another provocation to kind of poke at where I'm drawing connections here, as I'm sure you all are as well. Um, cos- Cosmetic genetic engineering and plastic surgery. That's my provocation.
I feel like that's a really great thing to bring up because like the distinction between like any version of like body modification, like I feel like the topics and conversation are like along the same line.
I wanted to add on to like the discussion of like clinical versus recreational and cosmetic. Like, I think that in the clinical regard, that like in the terms of like removing hereditary diseases and things like that, it has the in that regard it has the capacity to have like the same effect upon health, I think, as like the first vaccines did, like the polio vaccine did, if we like can eradicate hereditary diseases like that. But when we cross into like recreational and cosmetic things like my baby will be tall, he'll be a genius, he will look this way, he will uh, have these mannerisms, like it's this sort of like population engineering, I think, and like that to me has a very scary uh very scary, almost like, how do I phrase this, like it's almost sort of eugenicist to me.
Um, I don't know if this is really necessary in this conversation to put ahead, but I just want to, give you guys this insight about the social aspects of any cosmetic or plastic surgery. I mean, at least at least that's what I have noticed, is that once anyone goes through plastic surgery or any cosmetic modifications to their body, it's very negative. I mean, a lot of people, there's a lot of backlash. It's like, why can't you accept your body? I think people should be okay with having any modifications done to their body. I mean, people should be okay with having someone else do it to their own bodies. I mean, it's not that you have to do it to your own body, but there must be no negative feelings attached to it, or there must be no backlash that is that a person experiences, because you know that can, I think that would be a very very big hindrance in any change, or any change in bioethics.
One something that honestly, like I've been thinking about this whole time, is like that precedent of chasing that toxic idea of perfection in terms of how you appear. I mean, obviously it's toxic because perfection doesn't exist, and as we see with clothes, we see with music, what we feel is beautiful consistently changes throughout society and throughout history. But also, one of the most important things in life is to understand, or find the things that potentially you may feel are not ideal, or that society may feel aren't ideal, and to use those imperfections to enhance your character, to enhance who you are. Developing those character traits, in my opinion at least, is way more beneficial than fitting in exactly with what society wants you to think, or what it wants you to, I guess, look like. And so I would really be uncomfortable with people robbing themselves of chances to progress who they are, simply because they're removing superficial barriers that, if there, would cause them to, do some hardcore reflection about who they are, and the resilience and the compassion and empathy that they need to develop.
Love that.
Yeah, no, I think that's an incredible point, Nick.
I
And
love that too. I love that very much.
um also just thinking about the fact that like it's really important to like we talk a lot about like human flourishing here, but like everything that like an individual does impacts the wider community. And so like even though it might be like a personal preference and you're doing this for you and this technically has no like implications on other people, a lot of times there's like issues with like transparency about like what someone might have like modified their body to, and it sets this like new cultural standard. And so a lot of you'll find yourself in situations where like people are comparing themselves to people who have literally achieved an aesthetic by means that extend beyond themselves. And that's like a really, really difficult thing to like even comprehend, even if like logically you are aware that that's unachievable. Like your classic example of this is like the Kardashians and like the way that like young girls compare themselves online. Like that is, even though like logically speaking there's a level of awareness that like a lot goes into that, um it's a distinction that's hard to make like emotionally, and like creates challenges that aren't quite there. And so I'm just worried about like aggravating that situation, but like with advantages that could have like real world, like not just real world implications, everything has real world implications, but like advantages that could create an even wider gap, because there's a likelihood that all of these advancements in technology directly go to those who can afford it. And so you're like increasing this like wealth inequality gap. Like there's an inequality gap that's going to like double take in the turn of this, which is why ethics is such a big deal in this conversation.
And if I can just say something, I mean, okay, let's just say we have social implications if someone modifies their body in a particular way. But when we look into bioethics, there is going to be 100% chance that people are going to modify their body or modify particular parts of their genes to, you know, suit a particular aesthetic. How are we supposed to stop that? B, how are we supposed to reduce that if we can't stop it? And C, how do we remove the social barriers that exist? I mean, how do we normalize plastic surgery? Oh, and four, and should we normalize plastic surgery?
These issues are so difficult because there's valid reasons to get plastic surgery. I don't know. I mean, it's just not black and white.
I mean, to give you an example, if you're an acid attack victim, and every time you look into the mirror, you see yourself and you see the victim in yourself, you would want to get plastic surgery to, you know, um, give you a new perspective to life. I mean, how do you justify not having plastic surgery to a person who is literally living hell every day?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think there's different cases. Um, this is I'm not saying that this is the solution, but there's some YouTube channels that I watch where people that have certain conditions talk about their condition. Often it's like I don't know, deformities, disabilities, and it's I didn't watch it going in to feel better about myself, but it puts things in perspective. And so if you're just comparing yourself to people that are editing their photos and videos on Instagram, right, like you just don't have a realistic expectation of what humans are, you know. Yeah, that's one of the channels, Ashton. I like it a lot. I think the host is a great guy.
It's interesting because I think that we have like weaved different discussions throughout this. We've talked about, I think Ashton, he was almost talking about how this reflects similar instances in history in terms of eugenics and how that can, like Shabu said, collide with like a capitalist structure, and that might lead to like a free market eugenic system, and that will create almost like a genetic elite for those who are able to afford it. And then we're talking about like the societal implications of aesthetics and how this compares to editing that we're already doing. And we can also draw in the conversation about how we're already making these sort of decisions in terms of like pro-choice and pro-life, which are like more cruder ways of predetermining someone's life. So I was wondering from like regarding this question, in terms of like where you stand right now in time and history, looking back at what we've done and looking at like the genie bottle that might open here, what are your thoughts on like learning from the past and thinking about the future?
I'll start. People often don't know what is beneficial for preparing for the future. Like, I'm drawing connection to something that Nick said. Well, okay, so here's a great example of this. As long as any of you can think of things that your parents are encouraging you to do that do not prepare you to succeed in this emerging world, that just proves the entire point, right? But it's and then to say that you may be getting pressured to make genetic modifications to yourself that may completely backfire on you, whether it's a year later, 5 years later, 10 years later, etc. That's very scary.
I think like it's very like you cannot forecast the future, and the past is like virtually inadequate in like fully knowing the right choice to make going forward. Um, but like I almost look at it as like you can't have like destination thinking, like you can't operate for the sake of the destination, like the journey has to be like, good in and of itself. And so I think that like that has to be a part of the decision making, but I'm not quite sure how it applies in this context. But I like whatever you decide can't be like purely for the sake of the future, but like in the now, but it still has to have equal regard for like how this can pan out 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line. And that's a really tricky boundary to kind of cross.
Good point.
It's funny because that's the argument parents make about why you shouldn't get tattoos.
I've just been thinking about the Starbelly Sneetches, that Dr. Seuss book, where it's cool if you have a star, and then more people start getting stars, and so then people start saying not having a star is cool. It just seems like there'd be so much messiness. You do something that is permanent to who you are, that you theoretically can't change. That's a fundamental piece of your identity, and then at one point it was celebrated, and then just as a societal trend changes, all of a sudden you're punished for having that thing, and the sacrifice wasn't worth anything. So yeah, I like agree, making some of these risky changes, not knowing what the future is going to hold. I just think it's, I mean, like, I personally, I wouldn't do it, and I wouldn't have any of my kids do it.
I think beauty, or the concept of beauty, is ever changing. To give an example, nobody thought, people would normalize wearing pajamas to work. you know. But here we are. I'm wearing pajamas when I'm talking to you guys, mainly because it's 4:30 in the night. But yeah, um, 4:30 in the morning. But I mean, um, I would say beauty is very it shifts all the time. Even even having even making any modifications to your body would actually shift over time. For example, Chabu gave the example of the Kardashians. I mean, 5 years down the lane, you don't know. These people would be like laughed upon because they have plump lips and beautiful bodies. But so like everyone said, I wouldn't. It's very difficult to make a decision, but we have to do what is difficult. I mean, if we have to go anywhere in bioethics or anywhere in life or any way in scientific research, we have to make a calculated risk, and we have to understand. We have to study a little bit, look at the societal changes that have been happening through the years, but still, this is not like 100% chance that it would happen like that. I mean, you know, but we have to take. I mean, we have to take a calculated risk and do what we have to do.
So I think that over this conversation, we have naturally fallen into like a antagonization of this tech, but I'd like to mention that tech in itself is a neutral entity, and it's more of like how we deal with it and how we handle it. That's the problem. So there was a lot of question around if we're truly afraid of the tech, or if we're afraid of the society that surrounds it. We're very capitalist inclined, and so this might not be a problem about genetic engineering more than it is a problem about distributive justice and its accessibility in like the global context.
That is a very, very good point. I mean, it's the same thing, Will AI kill us? Will robots be the end of humankind? I mean, you still have to program these robots and AI. So, will humans be the end of humans?
I think that
Yeah.
like
Oh, go for it. Go for it, Chabu.
no, I just wanted to say that like the tech is coming even if our society's not ready for it. Um, and I can definitely say that we aren't in a place where like we'd react and respond well to it, and like it wouldn't like create new and more nuanced social issues, but it's on its way regardless or irrespective of that. And so I think like my follow-up thought is just like, how do we intend to mitigate that, or like what will that reaction be in terms of like creating as minimal of a like net negative as possible.
And just to the earlier point of, what are we more scared of, the technology or the society? Well, yeah, it's going to be the society. Like, I mean, a lot of us have probably seen the social dilemma by now, and you just see a really positive piece of technology and just how toxic it's become with social media. I also think so. Thomas Friedman, in the last few years, he's written this book called "Thank You for Being Late," in which he talks about how for most of human history, um, technology was developing at a pace where we were well ahead of it in terms of how we could adapt to it and the policies we'd write around it and how we'd structure our society around it. Um, but in just the last, gosh, few decades, how the advancement of technology is at a rate that is far faster than our adaptability to it. And so if you look at like one of the examples he uses autonomous cars, right? Or you can even look at a different example like the Lime scooters, right? Those scooters that just popped up all over society. They were a really good idea, but you see a lot of harm come about because we just weren't ready for the policies, and we weren't ready to adapt our society around it, because we usually invent. Now we're in the process of inventing technology, experimenting it on society, and then once we get that feedback loop of 10 or 20 years of the positive and negative effects, then we can, improve how we've experimented on it. but I guess it's just tough for the people in that generation who were the guinea pigs as we develop our technology.
Well said.
Yeah, so it's almost like we can compare this to how we've reacted to the pandemic. And something that's really cool is we have, if we were to say it generously, done pretty well. There's a lot of shortcomings for sure, but there was also talk about like reverse distribution, where we roll out these types of treatments and tech to communities that are already disadvantaged rather than giving it to those who need it the least.
That's actually the model that like Ontario, where I live, has right now, where it comes to like when it comes to vaccine, when it comes to getting the vaccine, they don't have enough supplies right now, and so the way they went about it was actually starting with like people who have like pre-existing conditions, any adult indigenous populations in the area, and like now they're doing it by age, so it started at like 60, and then every few weeks they like reduce the back rate. So I think it's at like 40 now. um so it is like a model that's being deployed, and I think it's makes sense when there's like a limited supply and resource. But just thinking about like, but that is completely and totally like orchestrated by the government. And so just thinking about like technology that emerges obviously takes up space more so in like a business model, and that would be highly unlikely to happen.
I think that is how most of the countries are going. That is how most of the countries are doing their vaccination policies. For example, in India, I know we are at, I think above, no, no, yeah, we are above 18 right now. So um, we have given vaccinations to almost about 50 or 40 to 50% of the population, and we're at above 18 right now. So I think that's how most of the countries are going about.
And so it seems like we've proven that we do have like the political capabilities to do this. But since this is kind of like us looking towards the future, and this is such a nascent topic, we have to also like investigate the general like the public's sentiment towards bioethics with like the things we've seen with big tech, which were really cool, shiny new things that turned out to be like monopolies. There's been more of like an anti-tech sentiment among progressives. And so how do you feel about the relationship between like tech and politicians these days?
So there used to be this thing. I'm probably gonna get the name wrong. Like this um, office. There used to be like this congressional office related to tech. Okay, I'll just talk about the function. There was some kind of body that did research on technology for congresspeople that was nonpartisan, and um, I think it was like in the mid to late 90s where it got defunded. And so it's not that congresspeople aren't getting briefed on tech, they're getting briefed on it by the people that make the tech, though, now. Right? Or they're just really clueless. Or they do their own research, but they don't like congresspeople are so busy that, well, and busy often fundraising. So how can they just be like independent experts at tech? I'm sure some of you probably saw the clips of this one congressperson asking Mark Zuckerberg how does Facebook make money, and like how are you gonna waste congressional time asking a question like that? So it's important that truly nonpartisan, like for the people research on tech gets funded.
Yeah, no, I love this question because like there's just so much about this dynamic that doesn't make the least amount of sense. To a point that Nick made earlier, like our if society is like not developing fast enough to keep up with tech, the government moving fast enough about anything, um, haven't seen it. And so the idea that they could keep up with like tech startups or like really, really fast paced like industries like that, it's an unrealistic expectation. And then also to follow up, just like referencing back to that Facebook hearing, we had like a trek about that something similar about like tech and democracy, and like tech is not supposed to like there's a lot of responsibility that's placed on the tech industry, especially social media, because there's so much social capital, there's so much actual capital that's invested in there's so much that takes place in those spaces, um and it's very like unmonitored, like you can essentially do anything, like it's not it goes unchecked, the power goes unchecked. And so there's almost like this expectation that tech companies should be the ones to like check that power or like create balance, and that's not something that we should be relying on them to do either. So it's a bit of a standstill in terms of like development and like monitoring and all those really important things. And I'm actually not even sure what would close that gap.
I really love the dynamic you mentioned about like technology not developing, no, society not developing fast enough to keep up with technology. Because like many of the biggest concerns about tech now, I think, are automation. And the thesis of like Andrew Yang's ideology, which he expounds in The War on Normal People, great book, check it out or buy it. And basically says that this tech, like an automation and such, it serves market interest and not the people. And I think that also applies to like media companies and such.
Yeah, so as we always do, it's almost like we kind of retrace to just like a common theme of like how self serving interests collide with social interests.
Yeah, and that is really it's one of the most complex problems that we face all the time. In systems thinking, there's there's these things called system archetypes. A lot of problems that we see in nature and in human-made systems, they organize themselves into patterns, and systems theorists have called them these patterns archetypes. And one archetype is called the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is where the incentive of the individual gain is greater than the collective incentive to preserve a societal resource. So, like an example of this is like air pollution, right? It's in society's best interest to not pollute the air and to not use technology that pollutes the air, like cars. But individually, the interest is so strong for each one of us to do it. And theoretically, like if in the middle of winter I were to just not drive my car for the air, the tragedy, and that's why they call it a tragedy, is that even if I were to make the sacrifices to make that aspect of society better, I still didn't make an impact. It does require a massive collective effort of sacrifice in order for it to work. And until you obtain a critical mass and can use that positive peer pressure to get that tipping point, it's just so hard to outweigh the huge advantages that come with pursuing your own individual interests instead of taking massive sacrifices to impact society in a way that's not even measurable.
Yeah, no, that like is literally the archetype that plays out in everything. Like even just thinking about like environmental issues, like there are people who literally go above and beyond and have almost like a virtually like no carbon footprint, but that means very little in the wide scope of things, but that also disincentivizes people to do the little that they can to reach what you said was like the critical mass. Um, and I feel like that with the conversation of like biotech, I foresee there being like a very concentrated source of power in terms of like who dictates what happens in this industry. Um, and it's almost important that like if they're convinced that it's, you know, there's like certain ethical limitations that need to be in place, we stand a better chance of there being like less that plays out. But I wouldn't even know what that like intervention could or would look like.
I have a question to pose. So I don't know if I'm getting this right. This is out of my memory. I remember this from 2 years ago. So there was this Russian scientist that did CRISPR technology, and it's did that use that technology to modify two twins. But the parents were not aware of this, and once they were aware, but the children did not have any comorbidities or any genetical issues. But once they were aware of this CRISPR technology used on their children, they sued the scientists for I think $1 million. I don't remember clearly, but they sued the scientists. Do you think what they did is right or wrong?
I think to experiment on somebody's children without the consent of their parents, those children are not able to consent to such a measure nor to understand such a measure. Just to not do it with the consent of the parents or inform them of what was going on. It's just really, really wrong.
Is it still wrong if the children live longer than normal people would usually live and live a better and healthier life?
Well, I think when you subject somebody's children to such scientific experiments that the parents of those children should have the
Hmm.
right of information to what is happening. Because
Yeah,
like,
that's the one they sued them
yeah,
for.
because like you don't really know if that will be the conclusion of it. Like if there will be a positive effect.
So now it's like we're kind of navigating the question of like free will itself and how it plays in the context of parents and the patient who, in most cases, might be unborn, and how that will affect kind of like us in terms of our like our psyches, because we're going to be offered so many more affordances, and how will we deal with those choices?
Especially with the fact that like there's so much decision fatigue already with like the influx of information that we have, like this level of awareness is proven to be hard to cope with as an individual human being. Um, so that's actually really important.
So nobody's for the scientist.
I think it's like a really hard call to make. Like it's not. I don't feel like anyone's made like a definitive call, but there's just a lot of implications to consider.
Yeah, this is a case that really happened I think 2 years ago. I do not remember. And the scientist was they had to pay $1 million, and any I think it was also under medical negligence. God. And they if any complications would occur, the scientists would have to pay. So
Hey Jahi, should we
and
move to reflection? Because I know we can talk a while about all
oh,
this.
is it time for reflection? Oh yes.
That seems like really quickly. I will be copying the link and sending it into the Yes, so I think I could begin. I kind of came into this with a lot of thoughts in my mind, and to be honest, none of them were quite clarified, but I think it opened up to like how us as Gen Z and millennials are considering this possibility, which is going to be such a huge part of our future. I think there's the willingness to discuss these things and look at it without self interest, hopefully, is going to be a North Star for us.
This was
Exactly.
definitely.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to quickly say for my reflection that this is definitely like one of the rare tracks where like not a lot of people have a lot of background knowledge on the issue, and so it was really interesting to see like the different themes that we were able to pull from it, that just spanned all different forms of like ethics, policy, politics, development, and even sci-fi. So I really enjoyed this conversation.
Same. I came into this track with very less to no knowledge about this particular topic. Um, I'm really interested in biology, and but I have no particular interest per se in bioethics. I have knowledge from here and say, but not anything that I've researched about. But I learned a lot in this track. I mean, to understand that this is a possibility in our future, that and we might have to take a decision as to do we do it or do we not do it. And I'm happy that we're open to having conversations about it, and I'm happy that we're open to taking decisions about the fact that we might have to do it one day.
Yeah, so the conversation around genetic engineering is very interesting to me. And by instinct, I think, like a lot of you, my gut reaction is that cosmetic or recreational genetic engineering is something that I would not really be comfortable with. But I have to kind of question myself to see if my ideology is consistent across different things that I believe in. So, like, why would I say that plastic surgery is okay if saying that like genetic engineering wouldn't be okay? Like, cosmetically, like, what's the difference? You can even take it to like what Jahi said with like abortion, right? Like, isn't that like the ultimate choice of of what someone's life would be? And I'm not saying I'm advocate for one thing or another, but just like it's very interesting to check yourself and make sure that you are being consistent across your ideology for different issues.
I think that's super powerful. My reflection is, well, what I'm thinking a lot about is I love tracks like this that, like like Jahi mentioned, it's not like a lot of questions were answered, but I think almost like the outside in looking at what's happening, that we're having a conversation about these topics that aren't often discussed, reminded me that, or it makes me suspect that this is not, these types of conversations aren't that happening that regularly unless you're like deemed like an expert about this stuff and you're like in some kind of ivory tower. And I think that this needs to be a normal topic that is talked about, and that everyone should feel comfortable. Like, no one should feel underqualified to talk about something that affects humanity in this way. So how can we get more people involved in this discussion?
I just love the broad swath of.
Oh, go for it, Ashton. You got it.
Okay. I just love the broad swath of topics like we covered in like tech and genes and information consent. This gives a lot of insight into the implications of one subject, and I hold a lot in value. I hold even more value in Gen Z after this.
I don't know about the rest of you, but I keep feeling like the world keeps getting better and worse at the same time. Like with technology, it solves so many problems and creates so many problems at the same time. And I feel like, just with the advances, the advances that we've been talking about with like bioethics and everything, I feel like, if it continues on its current trajectory, it's going to solve a lot of problems and make the world a better place. And it's going to create a lot of problems and make the world a worse place. And so I'm excited and terrified at the same time.
Super well said.
Yeah, so I think that would conclude our reflection and applications. And Nick, since this is your first trek, what did you think about our structure and the conversation that we were able to create?
Loved it. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, had a good time.
Thank you. Well, that's good to hear. We covered so much, and I think that this was, like Gary said, unconventional but very integral because we're going to be part of the next few decades. And we'll have to be part of these conversations in the future. So, otherwise, thank you for joining tonight, and I wish you guys a good rest of your night or morning.
You did a great job, Jahi. Thank you so much.
Yes, you were amazing.
Fantastic.
See you, folks.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye bye.